I'm a political science major, and I'm a member of the class of 2019. I'm joined by Pedro Gratterol here, who will be moderating the question and answer session after the lecture. Pedro is a political science and music double major, and a member of the class of 2021. Our next lecture will be presented by Professor David Blight. Professor Blight teaches American history at Yale University. He received his undergraduate degree from Michigan State University and his doctorate from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. Professor Blight is the author of many books, including Frederick Douglass's Civil War and Race and Reunion. Later this year, his biography of Frederick Douglass will be published by Simon & Schuster. Please join me in welcoming Professor David Blight to Linfield.
Thank you very much. It's actually wonderful to see all the students involved in running this. Nick, they make you look good. Thank you to the Miller Center, all the terrific people who planned all of this, Lauren, getting us all here. And I want to say just something brief about my predecessors here, Lee and Diana. Terrific talks, set the stage for where we go next. Lee and I have collaborated a great deal. I think I've borrowed more documents from her than she borrowed from me. But we were trying to complete our books at the same time. She got done well before me. But we particularly collaborated on the letters written by Ottilia Assing, one of the women in the world of Frederick Douglass that you didn't get to ask her that much about. They were all written in an old German that had to be translated, and I luckily found a German law student at Yale who very much enjoyed reading all these old letters in German and translated them all for both of us. And we owe Katharina Schmidt a lot for figuring out what all those letters said. And they said a lot. Anyway, maybe we can come back to some of that. And Diana, as I said earlier, that was a brilliant reading of that incredible speech and that moment. I actually begin this new biography with that same story. I played off the language of first things in the speech. I can't remember exactly the inspiration for it now, but I decided that's how the book had to start. So the book actually begins by narrating the Freedmen's Memorial speech and the whole. It was a huge parade that day all over Washington that the black community of Washington put on. Huge, hundreds of people in the parade, and Douglass in the final carriage, as orator of the day. He rode in a lot of parades like that, but it's a special moment to understand Douglass's ideas. And then I take the first things notion and just go back to the Tuckahoe Creek and talk about his birth. It's a trick. Biography is all about tricking your reader into staying with you till the second chapter or so, at least. Now, if you put the word prophet in your title, which I have, you should be prepared to defend it. Prophet's a big word. It gets misused a lot, I'm sure. That's prophetic, or he's a prophet, or she's a prophet. But I do think Douglass qualifies. And in the process of writing this full life biography, which I'm going to overview in a moment, but focus on some ways that Douglass matters to try to pick up the theme that you set for this conference. I found myself wishing I'd had a degree in theology, or wishing I could take a year off and do nothing but read theology to understand how deeply steeped Douglass was, particularly in the Old Testament. There are ways we can discern and analyze of how that came about from his earliest days of reading the Columbian Order and then the Bible with Father Lawson in the streets of Baltimore, the churches that he was influenced by, 3 or 4 of them in Baltimore, the preachers he was influenced by, a couple of them white, a couple of them black, then his beginnings in public oratory in the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church of New Bedford, where he was in effect ordained as a preacher when he was 21. That ordination process basically meant the congregation said, "You're good, preach." And he was, and he did. But I'd still wished I had had time or a way to learn more theology. I asked a lot of people. I asked good friends to help me out, and they did. They pointed me to many scholars, particularly the Old Testament, to try to get a grasp on just how Douglass was so effective at, a way I like to put it is, embedding his pain in story, and particularly in the great story of the Old Testament. I was pointed toward many authors, Walter Brueggemann for one, who's written more books on the Old Testament than would fit in one of those rows over there. And how cool is it, by the way, to hold this in a library? I love libraries. I always say, if the world's going to end, I mean, if we know it's coming, all of us should just go to the local library or a college library and just party with books. Why not? Get open bar and books. What else do you need? Anyway, this is cool to hold it here. Anyway. But a number of people pointed me toward Abraham Heschel, the great Jewish theologian, particularly a local rabbi in New Haven, whom I got to know so well, and he kept listening to me. He'd come to my lecture class. He just kept listening to me all the time. He said, David, just read Abraham Heschel. He wrote a book called The Prophets. You may not need any more than that. And he's almost right. Heschel's famous book called The Prophets spends the first 60-page or so chapter trying to define what is a prophet. Now, Heschel's tradition is, of course, Judaism, and he's defining the Hebrew prophets of the Old Testament by and large. But he says, among many things, and it's worth thinking, does Douglass fit these statements? Heschel: the prophet faces a coalition of callousness and established authority, and undertakes to stop a mighty stream with mere words. That's Douglass. The only weapon Douglass ever had was words. He never had any real power. He got a few appointive offices, but his power was in words, written and spoken. Heschel: to be a prophet is both a distinction and an affliction. The analysis you can read of the Hebrew prophets is that, they weren't supposed to want to be prophets. Jeremiah didn't want to be, but had to. Douglass actually kind of liked it, if and when he became self-aware of that. He never called himself a prophet, although he used the word a lot. Heschel: the prophets must have been shattered by some cataclysmic experience in order to be able to shatter others. Douglass could shatter your sense of righteousness, your pretensions, your sense of history, your sense of patriotism, your hypocrisy. But he'd been shattered. And just a fourth Heschel. The prophet is human, yet he employs notes one octave too high for our ears. He experiences moments that defy our understanding. He is neither a singing saint nor a moralizing poet, but an assaulter of the mind. I like that one too. I kept fighting with myself about which Heschel quote would be an epigraph on the book. But instead I found one simple little line where Douglass says, there's a silent prophet in all of us, and I decided, that's got to be the epigraph. So Heschel doesn't make it in there. Anyway, behold, I have put my words in your mouth to pluck up and to break down, to destroy and to overthrow, to build and to plant. It's a line in the first chapter of Jeremiah that Douglass took very seriously. Those four simple little lines almost define what he attempts with rhetoric over time. And then I want to use one other little verse to set up what I'll do at the end of this talk. He embeds his pain and his people's story in other stories. In Genesis 8 is the line, "And the dove came into him in the evening, and lo, in her mouth was an olive leaf plucked off. So Noah knew that the waters were abated from the earth." The Noah's Ark story. Keep it in mind. I'll come back to it. In his speech at the dedication of the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, September 24, 2016, President Barack Obama delivered what he termed a clear-eyed view of a tragic and triumphant history of black Americans in the United States. This was the opening of the great new African American Museum in Washington. Obama spoke of a history that is central to the larger American story and one that is both contradictory and extraordinary. He likened the African American experience to the infinite depths of Shakespeare and Scripture. Those were Obama's words. His speechwriting staff nailed this one pretty good. It was, he's a lame duck, and the election's only less than a month away, but they wrote a good one for him here to go out with. Obama, "The embrace of truth as best we can know it is where real patriotism lies." And then, naming some of the major pivots of the nation's past, Obama wrapped his central theme in a remarkable sentence about the epic of the Civil War era. Quoting Obama, "We've buttoned up our Union blues to join the fight for our freedom. We've railed against injustice for decade upon decade, a lifetime of struggle and progress and enlightenment that we see etched in Frederick Douglass's mighty leonine gaze." Now, it's presidential rhetoric. We all know that. It's an occasional speech at the dedication of a museum. But the fact that he would choose Douglass in his first paragraph of that speech and refer to the leonine gaze, take your pick. Which leonine gaze would you like? Is interesting. It may say something about Douglass's emergence finally as an image, a personality that one likes to think is a household name, although that's clearly still not true. President Trump had a bad memory on that one. Now, how Americans react to Douglass's gaze, or however we want to think about that, how we gaze back at him, and more importantly, how we read, appropriate him, or engage his legacies, informs in some ways how we use our past to determine who we are. We do this all the time with historical personages. Douglass's life and writing emerged from nearly the full scope of the 19th century. They're representative of the best and the worst in the American spirit. He constantly probed the ironies of America's contradictions over slavery and race. Few Americans, picking up on Obama here, used Shakespeare and the Bible to comprehend his own story and that of his people as much as Douglass. And there may be no better example of an American radical patriot than the slave who became a lyrical prophet of the ideas of freedom, the natural rights tradition, and human equality. Obama sort of channeled Douglass in that dedication speech, and knowingly or not, so do a lot of people today. Now, Douglass lived, most of you know this, but it's worth reflecting on a minute. Douglass lived 20 years as a slave, nearly 9 years as a fugitive slave subject to recapture, and then from the early 1840s to his death in 1895, over 50 years, he attained this international fame as abolitionist, editor, orator of almost unparalleled stature in oratory, and the author of the 3 autobiographies, which are classics of the genre. As a public man, he began his abolitionist career 2 decades before America would divide and fight the Civil War over slavery, that he welcomed, make no mistake. He was born in a backwater of a slave society of the South on the eastern shore of Maryland, just as steamboats appeared in bays and on American rivers, before the telegraph, before the railroad, before the rotary press changed human mobility and human consciousness. And he would use all of those new technologies to their fullest extent to forge his own life. He died after the emergence of electric lights, the telephone, and the invention of the phonograph. The renowned orator and traveler loved and used most of these elements of modernity. And a quick footnote on the phonograph. Lee and others here, I'm sure you've been asked, was Douglass taped? And the answer is no, not that we know of. It was available. He could have been, but he wasn't. And there's an extraordinary letter in his papers. Some of you may have seen it. It's in the fall of '94, 3 months roughly before he dies. He goes to dinner one night at a man's house in Washington. His name was Anderson. And when he gets back, he writes this extraordinary thank you letter for dinner. But most of the letter is about the fact that Mr. Anderson played a phonograph tape of one of Douglass's friends, a reverend, a minister named Weirs, giving a sermon. Douglass heard a phonograph for the first time. And he writes in the letter things like, "Can it be true that the human voice could live forever?" And you quickly sense he's talking about himself. And he just gushes. He calls the phonograph a divine invention, like the human voice could be recorded forever. If he had been recorded, I don't think he would have written that letter. It's just one of those moments you think, God, why didn't somebody record him? He was the most photographed American of the 19th century, as most people here now know, from the wonderful new book by good friends of mine, John Stauffer, Zoe Trott, Celeste Bernier. There's a paperback edition out now that has yet 2 more photographs. I think they're up to 164 or so extant photos of Douglass. And we all rely on that book now. If you need an image of Douglass, they're all there. A lot of them are listed as circa 1891, circa 18 whatever, and that's a debate. I've recently chosen 80 images for this new biography, and I've contacted my friends, the editors of that book, and said, circa 55, huh? How'd you come by that? They said, we didn't know, we made it up. I thought, oh, okay, then I will too. I think it's a little later, so I'm doing circa 1850. Circa is one of those, C period, we just screw around with it. Anyway, it can never really be measured, and it can never really be measured, of course, but I think Douglass was the most traveled American of the 19th century, except for probably Mark Twain. And Twain cheated because he went to Asia, and also went to Europe more times. And he lived to 1910, so anyway. Nobody traveled more miles than this itinerant orator, even way into his old age. And there's a reason for that. He needed the money to support this extraordinary but dependent extended family. By the 1890s, in sheer miles and countless numbers of speeches, he had few rivals for fame in the golden age of oratory. All of his speeches didn't work, by the way. They weren't all home runs. There's enough evidence in the record to show that sometimes he flopped. And a lot of times he lost his voice. All kinds of clippings about, Mr. Douglass will not appear tonight. He has lost his voice. Okay. It just makes him more human. I also think, there's no way to measure this, but I also think more people heard Douglass speak in the 19th century than any other human being. Because you just start adding up the thousands and thousands of speeches and the sheer scale of his crowds. I cannot imagine who it would be. And he lived with all of the pleasures and perils of the problem of fame, more than anybody, with the possible exception of Ulysses Grant and P.T. Barnum. Douglass's dilemma with fame was a serious and quite modern problem. I love episodes like he's in Iowa on one of these lecture tours in the dead of winter in 1880 whatever, and here's a clipping. A newspaper reporter finds him in a train station, and it was a Milwaukee reporter. I don't know what the Milwaukee reporter was doing in Iowa City, but there he was, and he writes it up, and he goes, and Douglass was giving that William the Silent speech then, that this thing, he forgot this thing in his head that he needed to do more history. He needed to be a historian more. And he plucked William the Silent out of Dutch history as some kind of great creator of democracy. And he did this serious 25-page lecture on William the Silent. And it really did flop. And finally he just quit giving it. And he's in the Iowa City train station, and the reporter comes up and says, Mr. Douglass, you didn't seem to have your usual, power today. And Douglass says, yeah, this speech just doesn't seem to work. And then he jokes about the fact that, but I can't always thump it out like you want because, you know, I have false teeth and my teeth will fly out. But then even better, he says, because the reporter asks, so what's the biggest thing you face here out on the road? And he says, talking to people like you. I love that line, you know. Every celebrity of some kind, it's just talking to, anyway, human moments. But it became an American wonder, if that's a fair term, a phenomenon, an American thing to have seen Douglass, to have heard Douglass, to tell your children, I saw Douglass. The first time I saw Douglass. He lived to see and interpret black emancipation, to work actively for women's rights for a very long time through peaks and valleys, as Lee showed us. In fact, long before it was achieved. He lived to realize the civil rights triumphs and tragedies of Reconstruction and to witness and contribute to America's economic and international expansion in the Gilded Age. He lived to the age of lynching and Jim Crow laws, when America collapsed into retreat from the very victories and revolutions that he had helped to win, or he liked to think he had helped to win. He played a pivotal role in America's second founding out of the apocalypse of the Civil War, and he loved thinking about himself as a kind of founder of a second American republic. There were, though, many Douglasses. He was many things. You can't put him in a solitary box. And there is a set of apparent paradoxes about his life that make his story, I think, attractive to biographers and to scholars of all kinds. And it makes him the object of appropriation today by many different kinds of constituencies. He was a radical thinker and a proponent, as many of you have written, of classic 19th century political liberalism. He did tend to always see, by and large, all solutions in politics and in law, and not in economic analysis, by and large. At different times, he hated and loved his country. Depends on when you ask or when you look. He was a ferocious critic of the United States and all of its hypocrisies, but also, after emancipation, became a government bureaucrat, a diplomat, and a voice of expansion, even a kind of American imperialist. He strongly believed in self-reliance and demanded, at the same time, an activist, interventionist government at all levels to free slaves, defeat the Confederacy, and protect black citizens against terror and discrimination. Douglass was, and some of you have written on this too, a serious constitutional thinker. That speech in Edinburgh in 1860 is still taught in many law schools. I remember when I was first told by a colleague in the Yale Law School, oh, we teach that Edinburgh speech. And I said, which Edinburgh speech? And they said, oh, really? You teach that? How cool. Few Americans have ever analyzed race with more poignancy and nuance than this mostly self-taught genius with words. No one, I think, grasped quite as openly the absurdities of race at the same time he knew he would always live with and against its reality. He was a radical editor, writer, activist, but also a hard-earned pragmatist. Was he ever? Douglass was Jim Crowed more times than he could ever count. Railroads, trains, you name it. Hotels. But he loved the Declaration of Independence. He loved the natural rights tradition and to work with it. And he especially loved the second American Constitution, fashioned in Reconstruction. He fought against mob violence, but he believed in certain kinds of revolutionary violence. It depends on when you ask. It depends on when you look. And even in his 11-year relationship with John Brown, it depends on when you ask. In his own career, he heroically tried to forge a livelihood with his voice and his pen. But fundamentally, I think, was not a self-made man. An image and symbol he touted in a famous speech, one of his most famous speeches, and he carted that speech all over the American landscape and gave it countless times. And that image of Douglass as the self-made man and prophet of self-reliance is the Douglass that modern conservatives have adopted, especially libertarians at the Cato Institute, as a proponent of individualism. I recently wrote a New York Times op-ed about a recent book published by the Cato Institute, which boils Frederick Douglass down to one thing: self-reliance and individualism, which basically cuts out of his life his entire career as an abolitionist, which is a bit odd. He truly believed women were equal and ought to have all fundamental rights, but he conducted his own personal life sometimes as a genuine patriarch in a difficult marriage and while overseeing a large, often dysfunctional, extended family. And by the way, that self-made man image of Douglass is a very debatable idea, I grant that. How much was Douglass self-made? How much, if you read Lee's book, and I urge you to, it's a terrific book, you'll begin to realize there are a lot of women that helped make this man from his very beginning. But even in his professional life, the women he relied on, and said it over and over and over and over, ideologically and emotionally. In fact, this may be a moment to drill down just very briefly on, Lee could have gone on for hours on the story of Douglass and women, and probably would if you ask her. But Julia Griffiths, of whom we have no photograph, the English woman who comes to the States, moves in with the Douglass family for 6 years, or 3 of the 6, and then had to move out because of the Garrison scandal. Julia Griffiths is arguably, and we've both written on this and talked about it at great length, one of the greatest influences in his life. She saved his bacon, to say the least. She and her sister bought the mortgage on his house so he could save his house. She was his principal fundraiser. She raised the money to keep his newspaper alive, mostly from Gerrit Smith, the wealthy abolitionist, but by other means as well. She was an intrepid organizer and an intrepid editor. Douglass gave her credit for teaching him how to spell. I'm still looking for my Julia Griffiths, by the way. And she was a manager. Douglass's newspaper would have died without Julia Griffiths. There's no question. The North Star, and then he renames it 1851. And it's terribly important to understand, at least in biographical terms, that period when Douglass comes back from England, the triumphal, 18, 19 months he spends in the British Isles, which does kind of remake him, and of course, British friends bought his freedom. But between 47 and, let's say, 1853, 54, 55, this man is in his early 30s. He's the self-made man who cannot provide for his family. He cannot keep his only profession alive without Julia's incredibly talented support, not to mention Anna's keeping of the home and raising of the children and planting of an amazing garden in Rochester. he has, without question, an emotional breakdown, a nervous breakdown, whatever we want to call it. It's all there in the Julia Griffith's letters to Gerrit Smith and others, and it's also there in Douglass's newspaper. There's several instances in 51 and 52 where Douglass comes clean in the newspaper and says, I'm not writing editorials this month because I'm incapacitated. I cannot function. Julia would describe him at times as bound to his bed because his limbs wouldn't work. She calls him suicidal at one point. Now, she's also doing that in letters to Gerrit Smith where she's trying to raise money. So you got to be slightly careful with some of Julia's adjectives. But the descriptions, there's no question, he had a breakdown over and over in the early 1850s. Try to imagine you're going to end slavery in the United States in 1852 in the wake of the Fugitive Slave Law. Go devote your life to that. And by the way, you got 5 kids at home. And you're all black in a country that shows absolutely no sign in the wake of the Fugitive Slave Law of ever thinking of you as citizens. But go out and do it anyway. Here's the key, though. He does arguably his greatest work, with the exception of the Freedmen's Memorial speech and a few others. He does his greatest work in this crisis. He writes the 4th of July speech, the rhetorical masterpiece of abolitionism. He writes his one novella, The Heroic Slave, which was prompted by Julia Griffith because it was to appear in her book called Autographs for Freedom. He learns the art of the short-form editorial, the political editorial for his newspaper, which he became brilliant at, analyzing every conceivable kind of political issue, from fugitive slaves to possible uses of violence to all sorts of things, to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And he writes several other masterpiece speeches in this particular 3 to 5 year moment of his life. And then toward the end of this period, what does he do? He writes the long-form masterpiece of his life, My Bondage and My Freedom, the second autobiography, the greatest of all slave narratives, one of the greatest autobiographies in American history. He did all that when he was falling to pieces. Now, that's not unusual in the life of great writers and artists, probably, but it's worth remembering. Context and timing are everything, of course, in all biography, in all lives. As James Baldwin wrote in 1948, casting sentiment and celebration aside, this is the young Baldwin who just shot from the hip about everything, as some of you know. You're taking a course on Baldwin. You guys know this. In 48, he says, quote, Frederick Douglass was first of all a man, honest within the limitations of his character and his time, frequently misguided, sometimes pompous, gifted but not always a hero, and no saint at all. Oh, and when you first read that, you think, oh, Jimmy, lighten up. Come on, man, this is Frederick Douglass. You want Baldwin to just be, gushing or something. No. Baldwin's unabashed bluntness is a good place for a biographer to begin, I think, to make your own judgments. But so are the interpretations of a very different writer, the former neoconservative turned neoliberal journalist and political theorist Michael Lind. In 1995, Lind rejected both a leftist multiculturalism and a conservative self-help individualism and called for what he called back then a new nationalism, which he termed, this is a loaded phrase, multiracial mixed-race trans-America, which we just call diversity now. And in so doing that, he announced that Frederick Douglass was the model. And he called Douglass, quote, the greatest American of all time. Well, hyperbole maybe, but it's quite an analysis of Douglass as our father of multiculturalism, multiracialism, diversity. Indeed, the old fugitive slave has become, in the early 21st century, a very malleable figure, even amidst all these paradoxes and contradictions. And he's been adopted by all elements of the political spectrum, not least of which is current Republicans, who have claimed Douglass, quite ahistorically, I've argued, as their own by elevating a single feature of his thought, which I already mentioned, black self-reliance, at the expense of his radicalism. At the unveiling ceremony of the statue of Frederick Douglass in the United States Capitol in 2013, I was privileged to be there. He was so chosen by the District of Columbia, as many of you may know. Each state, including the district, in this sense, the district is allowed to be a state. Each state gets 2, and Washington hadn't declared its second, so they chose Douglass. But congressional Republicans at that event, and it's a huge congressional event, when they unveil a statue in Statuary Hall, it's all the leadership of Congress has to speak. So Boehner spoke, McConnell, Joe Biden spoke, Nancy Pelosi, on and on and on. They all had a 8 to 10 minute staff-prepared speech. It turned into a totally partisan event. All of the Republicans talked about what a great Republican Frederick Douglass was, and they're wearing these buttons that said, large buttons, not just a pin. It said, Frederick Douglass was a Republican, in case you didn't know. But then the Democrats got up, and every one of them, the talking point was, Douglass was in favor of home rule for the District of Columbia. And there was a speech in the 1880s where he explicitly argued statehood for the District of Columbia. They ought to have statehood. They didn't have representation. So it was a totally partisan event. But it was another example among hundreds of how we now kind of, our culture, or political culture anyway, has to kind of get right with Douglass. There used to be this old phrase of getting right with Lincoln. David Donald famously wrote an essay by that title in the 1950s, that in American politics you had to get right with Lincoln. There's a sense now in our highly racialized political culture that you have to get right with Douglass and find your way to use him, make him a usable past. It's all right. I mean, we do this with everything. We just have all these historians around picking at you, and we want to tell you when you're wrong. You know, that's all. And one other quick thing, the ways Douglass gets used now. He's now a character in all kinds of works of fiction. Have you noticed that? Yeah, you're from the English department. It's amazing, and I know I've missed some of them, but I wrote a new edition to a new introduction to my edition of the Douglass narrative, and I wrote about these not 5 novels, there are others now, where Douglass becomes a character, sometimes a very prominent character, as in Russell Banks's Cloud Splitter, which is a novel mostly about John Brown, but Frederick Douglass has a very big role in that novel. Then there's Colin McCann, the great Irish, now American writer, who wrote a book of novellas called Transatlantic, and one of the novellas is about Douglass in Ireland. And it's the only time in my life a novelist sent me his manuscript to read it in manuscript. I mean, it's fiction. I was honored. I'd love to read it. I just told him, I love it. Even all the things you made up. I wish I could do that. This is so cool, what you get to do, you novelist. It was great. Or The Good Lord Bird by James McBride. Oh my God, Douglass is a womanizing drunk in that book. It's another John Brown novel, National Book Award winner. Amitav Ghosh, the great Indian writer, in his novel Sea of Poppies. This is a classic in world literature now, I'm told. Fred Bailey becomes a character on a ship sailing out of Baltimore. And a bunch of the guys on the ship are remembering seeing Fred Bailey getting beaten up on the docks in Baltimore. And you think, what? What's he doing there? But my favorite example is by the wonderful Nigerian writer, Chimamanda Adichie. She's probably most famous for that novel called Americana. But she wrote a novel you should read called Half of a Yellow Sun. It's a novel about the Biafran Civil War, the bloody, horrible Biafran Civil War that some of us are old enough to remember the news about in the 60s. There's a character, a young 13-year-old boy who gets forced into the Biafran rebels' army. He's a boy soldier. He's traumatized, horribly traumatized by battle. And fairly early in the book, his unit is camped in an abandoned, destroyed schoolhouse. And he's just sitting there, and he looks at the blackboard, He looks behind the blackboard, and there are a bunch of books. So he grabs one of them out, and lo and behold, it's Frederick Douglass's narrative. And the boy sits down and spends 2 days reading Douglass's narrative. And then Douglass's narrative becomes a leitmotif throughout the rest of the book. It keeps this kid kind of emotionally alive. Now, I've never met Adichie. I actually invited her to Yale once, but she couldn't come. I'm dying to get a chance to talk to her and find out why. Why did you grew up in Nigeria. Why did you use Douglass? Anyway, he's everywhere. Monuments are appearing everywhere. There are monuments in Ireland, Scotland. I don't know where the next monument's going. And he only spent 4 months in Ireland. You'd think he's like a patron saint there now or something. I don't know. And he's, of course, been celebrated or used in lots and lots of poetry. The sheer complexity of his thought and life is what makes him an icon, held in some degree of commonality sometimes. He was brilliant, courageous, and possessed a truly uncommon endurance of racism, as he also delivered one ferocious critique of it after another. He wrote so many words that will last forever. His literary genius ranks with many of America's greatest writers of his century. But he was also vain, arrogant at times, hypersensitive to slights. He did not take well to rivals who challenged his position as the greatest spokesman of his race, especially the younger ones. Although he also mentored many younger black writers and leaders, he all but adopted Paul Laurence Dunbar. He liked being on a pedestal, and he did not intend to get knocked off. He was thoroughly and beautifully human. Now, I want to run you through like just 6 big themes about this, why Douglass matters, and I'll be done. But I first want to say the reason I did this biography, and I never miss a chance, which I was saying to a few of you earlier, is because about 8 or 9 years ago, I had the unbelievable blind good luck to bump into a private collection of Douglass manuscripts and material that Lee has now used as well, owned by Walter Evans, a retired African-American surgeon and collector par excellence, who grew up in segregated Savannah, went north for education, practiced medicine and surgery in Detroit for 35 years, started collecting in the 1970s, and has a huge 4-story brownstone house in Savannah chock full of manuscripts, rare books, and probably the greatest private collection of African-American art anywhere in the world. I was in Savannah about 9 years ago to give a talk on Douglass's narrative to high school teachers, and they said, there's a local collector here, he'd like to have lunch. I said, fine. He takes me to his house afterward, gets out his Douglass collection on his dining room table, which is a long table, and it was one of those moments when I thought, damn, I don't want to write a full life of Douglass. I don't want to go through that torture. But if I don't, somebody else will. And a couple of years later, Lee and I met, and she's been there many times now. It doesn't get much better than doing research on the dining room table of a beautiful house in Savannah. So that collection, though, opens up particularly the later life of Douglass. The heart of the collection is 9 or 10 huge family scrapbooks that were kept by his sons over the last 30, 35 years of their father's life. That's the reason. And that last third of his life is the part of Douglass we don't know as well. Even if Americans know something about Douglass, it's usually the heroic young Douglass who escaped from slavery. Unless we're scholars and political theorists, and then we read them all the way through. But. All right, 6 big themes. Why not? And then you can add to them and criticize. The first I've already mentioned. He was a person of words. I wanted to first call this book, which I think I was saying to Diana at lunch, the biography of a voice. My editor, though, wouldn't have it. He said, that sounds too literary. Yeah, but that's really what you're writing. if you're doing a biography of Douglass, in many ways. Spoken and written language was the only weapon he ever really had. A weapon of protest, a weapon of persuasion, sometimes a weapon of power. Somebody asked earlier, how much influence did that speech, the oration at the Freedmen's Memorial, have? Very good question. Probably not much. Did he reshape Reconstruction policy with that speech? No, not really. Words. He's a creature of words. You are always trying to understand the words in the context he uses them, and you're even at times trying to understand the mystery of how he comes by them. 2, the first problem you face as a biographer of Douglass is the autobiographies. The autobiographies become themselves a theme, themselves a subject throughout trying to write about the life of Douglass, because he imposed 1,200 words of autobiography on us. My image of Douglass is, and I've had so many nightmares about this, but my image of Douglass, he's sitting in a little seminar room, and I got him trapped. You know, Lee Faught's there, and John Stauffer's there, and maybe we'll let Skip Gates come, and Nicholas Buchla will come, a bunch of us. We're going to get him in a room, and we're going to have him. We might even have to strap him down to a chair, which is not a good metaphor for a former slave. But anyway, but we got him now. And we're going to pump him with the questions we want to ask. Because there's so much he never said a word about, as Lee was saying, in the autobiographies. Mr. Douglass, what did you really think of Lincoln? Mr. Douglass, talk about Anna. Anna gets one mention in 1,200 words of autobiography. Mr. Douglass, your sons. They really struggled. What was that like? On and on and on I could go. Mr. Douglass, Ottilia Ossing, you had a 23-year relationship of some kind with a German woman who had tremendous influence on you. Tell the truth about it. You know, it's not going to happen. He sits there in that room, and as soon as we pump him with the questions, he slithers out of the chair and he's out the door. But the autobiographies are also an amazing source for the psychology of slavery, slaveholding and being a slave. There's nothing else in our literature quite as good as Douglass describing the psychic dimension of being enslaved, and then even describing the psychic dimensions of being a slaveholder. And the autobiographies, too, are laced with his biblical knowledge and his biblical storytelling. He can't resist it. He just throws in passages from Isaiah and throws in passages from Jeremiah here and there and every now and then. Sometimes verbatim, sometimes paraphrases. You don't even know what's happening. And in those autobiographies, and then I'll leave it, he showed us that he was forever hurt, scarred by slavery, and had a deep need. I can't prove this, but I can certainly speculate on it 100 times over, of just how much rage he needed to expend in his ability to write and speak over time from his experience as a slave and the experience of his kinfolk as a slave. Yeats once wrote, his words, "Mad Ireland hurt me into poetry." Well, slavery hurt Douglass into autobiography. Oh, but the stuff he hides. Third big theme is the Bible, and I won't dwell too long on this. I've already said something about it. Other Douglass scholars have certainly brushed up to this issue, but religion's not a simple subject in the academy, as we all know. But this is the 19th century. And even when Douglass may have lost personal faith to some extent, which is never easy to measure or even understand, he could never employ words without falling back at some point on the great Old Testament narrative of exile and return, of how the temple had to be destroyed before it could ever be reimagined, that there had to be an Egyptian bondage before there could ever be some Jordan to cross. He took the central story of the Old Testament. He put African Americans into the middle of it and the United States as the Jerusalem in the middle of it. And without that story, there wouldn't be a Douglass. He was a kind of living prophet of an American destruction, exile, war for its existence, and redemption. Particularly Jeremiah and Isaiah, as well as a few other prophets, were his guides. They gave him his story, his metaphor, his resolve, and a kind of ancient wisdom that he could always fall back upon. The prophet is human, don't forget, as Abraham Heschel said. Okay, I love dwelling on that, but I'd go too far. Fourth big theme, though, and this one I love because it's kind of obvious, but until you dig it up, we don't necessarily know it, and that's the crooked paths in his life from being that radical abolitionist, that radical outsider, to becoming, after emancipation and after the war, a political insider. During the greatest pivot of American history, the Civil War, this man of language reaped great change to transform from a radical abolitionist into a Republican Party functionary. These changes are historical. They're inextricably linked to events and time. They're not a matter merely of moral growth or decline. And they provide a model for many, many other leaders, particularly African American leaders, who have undergone the same process for the past 150 years and more, from the radical outsider to somehow inside of power and becoming a political insider. What happens to the radical reformer when he wins? When you win your victory? And all you got to do is look at that chapter in Life and Times entitled Vast Changes. It's Douglass's remembrance of the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. And look at the first paragraph. He goes on in this it's a lament. He is remembering this now from 1881, but he's remembering that as a moment, he says, when my congregation was gone. My community had disbanded. Nobody needed abolitionists anymore. What do I do, he said. And then he simply ends that paragraph with a line from Othello. Othello's occupation was gone. And when you go read Othello and read that soliloquy, it's Othello, which was Douglass's favorite Shakespeare for lots of reasons. It's Othello saying he's lost his army, he's lost his power, he's lost his status, he's lost his authority. He doesn't even know yet that he's about to lose his wife and kill her. Othello's occupation was gone. God. Anyway, how do you, when you've been this radical outsider, always beating on the door trying to get in, how do you square those old covenants and principles now with politics? How do you learn politics now, real politics? He did. He had to, and he took a lot of heat for it. We could come back to that. Fifth, I only got two more. Almost done. Hang in there. Okay. The fifth theme is simply what all biographers have to do, and Lee mentioned this. It's the balance of the private and the public lives. And we can come back to any part of that you'd like, including the Ottilia-Ossing relationship. But I think especially a part of Douglass's life that even people who know Douglass just don't know because it's deeply buried is this extended family, which gathers around Cedar Hill after he buys the place in the late 1870s, and they're always there. I mean, the grandchildren were always around. There are some loving reminiscences. There's one in particular by Frederica, a granddaughter, that's just priceless about what it was like to play with Frederick Douglass when she was 5 years old. Can you get this image? Douglass, he played with his grandchildren like crazy. Well, two images. They used to love to braid his hair. The girls would braid that white mane of hair, and they'd put it in all kinds of colorful ribbons. And Frederica describes the time when somebody famous came to the door, rang the doorbell, and there was Douglass in these crazy braids, and they had to hurry him back to the bedroom and get the braids out of his hair because he was meeting the Secretary of State or something. But even better, he installed 2 rings in the ceiling of the front porch, 2 rings that he could do pull-ups on. And she described how all the little kids would gather around. There's Douglass, that's 70 years old, hanging from the rings, kicking the kids. It's just not the image you have of Frederick. It's not in the textbooks, you know. But through the last 25 years of Douglass's life, it's one of the things this Walter Evans collection allows us access to, is just how dependent that extended family was on him. There are account books that show it, heartbreaking letters from the sons, and in some ways heartbreaking evidence of these long 3- and 4-month wintertime speaking tours he would do all over the Midwest, speaking at least every other day and sometimes every day for $100, $150 a pop, thousands of times in order to bring back the cash, to keep paying the bills for Cedar Hill and the bills for his son Charles and his son Frederick Jr. and his daughter Rosetta, who was in this disastrous marriage to this jerk named Nathan Sprague. Lastly, it's Douglass the thinker, which is what most of you are interested in, I think. It's Douglass the intellectual, the many-sided intellectual, who wrote everything from memoir to short-form editorials, extended speeches, one work of fiction, autobiography. He wrote in many, many different genres. He offered us beautiful metaphors, great storytelling, sermons, political stump speeches, assaults on the mind, to go back to Heschel's definition of a prophet, all kinds of avenues into and out of the natural rights tradition, a remarkable analysis extended over time of political liberalism and remarkable faith in political liberalism. He was an amazing mind on the problem of memory. He probed this idea of collective memory and individual memory, as well as anybody in the 19th century. He was a remarkable religious and theological thinker. He was a very serious journalist. We know that. He's now taught, as so many of you know, everywhere, law schools, history departments, English departments, art departments, political science departments, philosophy departments, etc. All right, last point. But it is Douglass's story that lasts the most and what instructs. There's no greater voice in the 19th century of that transformation from freedom to slavery, and from slavery to freedom, and whatever would come of that, than Douglass. And for all who wish to escape from an imprisonment of outward or inward captivity, even psychic captivity, they do well to feel the pulses of this life and read the words of his voice. It's why the narrative is so widely taught and so enduring. It's a coming-of-age story. And then you go act in the world, because that's what Douglass did, if we actually are trying to model him. In the final lines of My Bondage and My Freedom, that long-form masterpiece, in 1855, in the heart of, in the midst of the great slavery political crisis of the middle of the 1850s, how does he end that book? Go read the last lines, students, once again. He says he would never forget his humble origins. And then he says he would never cease, quote, while heaven lends me ability to use my voice, my pen, and my vote to advocate the great and primary work of the universal and unconditional emancipation of my race. My voice, my pen, my vote. It was as though Douglass was trying to describe to us, even in 1855, look, all I have is my voice, my pen, and my vote. And it's frankly all he ever had. And for most of us, it's all we ever have. Your pen, your voice, and your vote. So, students, What office are you running for? With your voice and your pen. Okay, thank you. I left out Noah's Ark there at the end. I didn't want to wear it out for you.
Hello, my name is Pedro Graterol. I'm a political science and music major, and I will moderate the question and answer session. So please raise your hand if you have a question or comment, and wait for the microphones to get to you.
In the middle row here, we have a man in need of a mic.
Thank you. That was wonderful. So I don't think I had the LSAT scores probably to get into Yale Law School. So I've never read the Edinburgh talk. Could you talk a little bit about his theory of constitutionalism in that talk?
Yeah, it's kind of the classic argument for the anti-slavery interpretation of the Constitution, which he had now embraced for, about 8 years by then. He'd come under the influence of Gerrit Smith and Gerrit Smith's circle of upstate New York abolitionists, under the influence of the Liberty Party, under the influence of the writing of William Goodell and others. And he'd come to argue that the Constitution can be used against slavery, that the language of forming a more perfect union, that the language of guaranteeing a republican form of government, the actual language of the Constitution could be construed, not just could be construed, but ought to be construed as anti-slavery. And then, of course, he pointed to the Bill of Rights. And in effect, you can see in Douglass's, and he's hardly alone in this, you can see in some of Douglass's arguments about the anti-slavery interpretation of the Constitution where the radical Republicans would go later with the 14th Amendment. That if you could federalize the Bill of Rights, you might just imagine overcoming the depth of states' rights tradition, which is part of what using the Constitution against slavery was always all about. Lincoln always said, I can't do anything about slavery in the South. It's their property there. It's legal. I can't act against slavery in the South constitutionally. Well, the anti-slavery interpretation of the Constitution had been arguing, for quite a long time, if you bought it, that you could federalize the Bill of Rights, apply it to everybody. You got to overcome a hell of a lot of racism to do it, but you could try. But that's what that speech does. When he goes back to England after John Brown's raid and he has to flee to Canada for his life, he's over there talking about John Brown a lot, but he also he trots out this constitutional lecture. He loved Scotland too. He had great audiences in Scotland. They adopted him. And he became, by the way, a lifetime fanatical lover of Robert Burns. Couldn't resist. That's just a quick kind of gloss on what that speech did. Yes, sir.
I just have a quick question. During the talk, you said that that Douglass was a classical liberal.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that, and what?
Yeah. Well, I
did it
mean that
manifest
he
itself?
saw virtually all solutions as political, not economic. That if you could change the political circumstances of people, they could use the vote. He seems to believe this until almost the bitter end against a lot of evidence, that if you could change the political circumstances of people, that through the vote, the power of the vote, they could control their own lives. Now, in the face of terror in the South, that doesn't work out so well. He believed in solutions through law and solutions through politics, which I take to be a form of political liberalism. No? Oh, okay, thanks. I borrowed a lot from Buchela's book on that and a few other people. Nick's book is brilliant on Douglass's use of natural rights. In case you didn't know, students should surely know that, of course. Yes? Nick. Nick's gonna take me apart here.
No.
After I
No,
buttered him up.
thank you, David. That's brilliant. And I'm honored to be included in your Douglass seminar nightmare. That's really quite a. I don't know if you're just doing that for the Linfield
You were right
crowd.
there, man,
Hopefully,
in the seminar
all
room.
those book talks you do in the fall, include me in when you tell that story.
I will. I will.
So I have a question. That I'd like. I like your use of Baldwin. Of course, of course, that really caught my attention, and I'm curious. I mean, the title of that piece that you quote is "Smaller Than Life," right? So he's Baldwin is critiquing a biography of Douglass that he thinks
By Shirley Graham Du Bois.
by Shirley Graham
Which is
Du
an
Bois.
awful little book. It wasn't fair what Baldwin did to that book.
I know. As a 24-year-old, by the way, as you mentioned, Baldwin was
And
24.
it's a children's book that he's reviewing. But go ahead.
But part of his point there is that he's critiquing a kind of. I mean, it really gets us thinking about the political function of biography and autobiography, right?
Yeah.
So he's critiquing the idea of portraying Douglass, as he says, as a Hollywood caricature, and for political reasons, right? He says that Graham is winning these awards for sort of helping with interracial understanding, right?
Right.
And
In
Baldwin,
1948.
In 1948, and Baldwin's worried about undermining his humanity and revealing this was a human being.
Yeah.
So this is part of my setup to say is, what do you think Douglass would think of your book?
Oh, God. Nick, I think he'd cringe at times about a few things. I'm a little hard on him. Lee has caught me at some of this. I'm a little hard on him sometimes about, I use the word abandonment of his children a couple of times. He didn't abandon them when he was young. He just was on the road all the time. And I've been cautioned about, I don't think he'd like some of the descriptions of that. When I talk about his vanity and his arrogance and his rivalry with some of the younger black leaders, oh, that stuff got ugly. And you got to tell the truth about that. He gave it back as hard as he took it from people like Richard T. Greener and John Mercer Langston and George Washington Williams and others. The younger generation of black leaders tended to be college educated. They wanted to knock Douglass off, and he's not always at his best when I think he'd cringe in some of those sections. I hope, I don't know, God, I don't want to think about that. But I would hope that the stress I put on his biblical grounding in this book, which I don't do as an act of faith, I do it as an act of research. I would hope he would say, yeah, you got it, finally, somebody, yeah. Because one of the things I wanted to ask him in that seminar in our nightmare is, God, Mr. Douglass, how much did you read your interpreter's guides to the Old Testament? Because he owned a whole bunch of them. We have Douglass's book collection. The National Park owns it. He owned single volumes on single books. He had a single interpretive guide to the book of Isaiah. How much he read them? I don't know. But I'd hope he'd actually want to have a real engagement. See, I'm making him alive again here, but he'd want to have a real engagement about that. He'd be really, really troubled by what we all do with the relationship with Attilia Ossing, I suspect. Although it may be the only thing that Lee and I have ever slightly disagreed on about the Ossing relationship. We can't think of anything else. You got to think of something to disagree on when you have to appear on panels. So, I don't know beyond that. I hope he'd think it was fair, but he probably wouldn't. I mean, who would ever think their biography is fair? No one. The part that would really trouble him, I suspect, the more I think about it, is all the attempts we all make to try to get underneath the autobiography, to try to explain to our reader what he's really revealing in the autobiography. He'd say, "You think that's what you don't know diddly what I'm revealing there," and he might have some trouble with my analysis of this emotional breakdown in the early 50s, but that's exactly what happened. God, I don't know. I'm probably sweetening it here. He'd probably hate it. I mean, don't most objects of biography hate the books written about them? I think they do. If they live to... Let's get him back and ask him. Anyway. Yes, ma'am. Hi. Oh, Noah's Ark. Oh, gosh, do I have 1 minute here? Well, two small minutes? Okay. Okay. Well, the only reason I use that is because it's an example of how Douglass could float into a biblical story when he needed it in a profound way. The circumstance is this. It's the election of 1864, which many of you know was an incredibly pivotal election. Lincoln in midsummer and by August believes he probably wouldn't be reelected. He was almost dumped by the Republican Party earlier. Calls Douglass to the White House in August. Calls Douglass to the White House. Their second meeting. The first meeting, Douglass went and knocked on the door of the White House. This time Lincoln calls him and asks Douglass to take over a scheme to free as many slaves as possible out of the Upper South in conjunction with the Army before Election Day, because Lincoln believes he may not be reelected. And Douglass was stunned. He had no clue how he was going to do this. But then came the fall of Atlanta. Sherman conquers the Shenandoah. Farragut takes Mobile Bay. And the prospects are much greater. Now, in the fall election, Douglass wanted to go on the stump for Lincoln. And the Republican Party wouldn't let him. Because the Republican Party at this point is trying not to run in favor of emancipation. We know this in our politics. The Democrats just savaged the Republicans in 1864 as the party of emancipation. They called Lincoln not only the Widowmaker, they called him Abraham Africanus I. They called him the N-word lover, and on and on and on. And they invented the word amalgamation. The Democratic Party in early 1864 invented the very word amalgamation, and they put out cartoons about amalgamation centers and parties held by the Republican Party. So they didn't want Douglass out there campaigning for Lincoln because they were trying to shy away from the emancipation issue, but there's no way they could. Then came election night. And Douglass is in Rochester, and this is one of the things I found in those incredible scrapbooks. There's a story, a reminiscence by a Rochester citizen, like 10 years later, 15 years later, says he was the poll worker the night of the election of 1864, and he put Frederick Douglass's ballot in the ballot box. Ooh. And then he says, I was walking back into the center of town late that night with Mr. Douglass, and a group of 4 or 5 drunken thugs came out of an alleyway, and they challenged Douglass. N-word, put up their dukes. And according to this reminiscence, Douglass put up his fist and said, come on, let's have it. And the guy claims the 4 drunken thugs scurried off into the alley, and Douglass won a major victory of whatever. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. I got one source for it, and I went with it. It's just too good a story. But that following Sunday, Douglass goes to Spring Street AME Church, a black church in Rochester, where he had spoken dozens and dozens and dozens of times. He often spoke there on Sunday afternoons. Lincoln, of course, won the election, 55% of the vote, 76% of the soldier vote. He's got a primarily black audience there, and he opens with the story of Noah's Ark. He tells the story of Noah sending the dove out, and the dove comes back with the olive branch in its teeth. And Noah wonders, oh my God, maybe the flood's over. Sends the dove out again, the dove doesn't come back. And so Noah takes the top of the tarp off the ark, and behold, the world is green. That's what the election of 1864 meant to Douglass. He went for the oldest rebirth metaphor in Western civilization. Then, another week later, he announced in that sermon speech that the next week he was going to Baltimore for the first time. He'd taken the train through Baltimore, but he'd never gotten out. He had never returned to Baltimore, where he escaped from slavery. And he went to Baltimore because the state of Maryland had just held a referendum and voted to become a free state on November 1st. Narrowly, by the way. It was like 12,400 to 12,100. But Maryland was suddenly a free state. So Douglass thought he'd go to Baltimore and celebrate it. And he went to the Bethel AME Church in Baltimore on Dallas Street down in Fells Point, where one of those churches he had worshipped in as a teenage slave. And he comes up to the front door, and lo and behold, a black woman, a bit older than him, meets him at the front door. It was Eliza, his sister, whom he hadn't seen since, about at least 1834, probably. Hello, Frederick, I'm your sister, Eliza. Eliza had purchased her freedom. It's a long story. She'd had eight children, I think. She'd named one of them for Frederick Douglass. He walks arm in arm up the main aisle of the church, and he speaks at a pulpit surrounded, the press said, by American flags. And he opens with the Noah's Ark story. We have press accounts of this. Noah sends the dove out. The dove comes back, sends it out again. But this time he says, but I am the dove. That I have returned to Baltimore is the sign that the world can be renewed. Now that takes chutzpah. Put yourself into the Noah's Ark story. But he did it. I am the dove, he says. Now, he could take a metaphor like that, a story from the Old Testament, and put it in place. And, the press accounts say the place went crazy. They were on their feet, weeping. That's how Douglass would use the Old Testament, because he knew his audiences knew the Old Testament. So.
Well, then please join me again to thank Professor Blight for the lecture.